Well, this is Book TV on C-SPAN 2, and we're at the University of Chicago, and we are joined by Professor Mark Philip Bradley, whose most recent book is Vietnam at War. Professor Bradley, what are you looking at in this book?
Well, the idea of the book was to think about the war from a Vietnamese perspective and to think about it in a kind of long historical durée. So for Americans, the Vietnam War is what the Vietnamese would call the American War, right? So we're talking late 1950s to 1975. But for most Vietnamese, the war began at the latest in 1946, and many would argue really at the beginning of the century as the French first came to take control of Vietnam. So the book's arc is to try to think back really as early as the 1890s and the coming of French rule, and to talk about anti-colonialism, to talk about the French War, to talk about the American War, and to talk about the war for memory in Vietnam since the war is over.
Has the Vietnamese perspective been lost throughout time?
Not in Vietnam, but
Right.
in other places in the world. And you know, the American War in Vietnam is the most written about topic in post-45 American history. There are thousands of books and articles, and that's just in the scholarly world. You know, you think about film and television programs and radio and all that sort of thing. So it's the kind of topic where, you know, Americans can barely turn around without hearing something about the war, but that literature is largely about the nature of American involvement, the experience of American soldiers who were there, with very little attention, in fact, to the kind of lived realities of the Vietnamese, whether it's high policy or whether it's people who were experiencing the war often at their doorstep. So no, surprisingly, even after 30 years, the attention on the Vietnamese themselves is relatively sparse.
What surprised you and what you learned?
Well, I think for me, as a historian, it was the more recent materials that were most surprising to me, and the ways in which the war has been front and center in Vietnam since 1975 as the Vietnamese moved from high socialism to a kind of form of market capitalism, albeit one run by the Communist Party, not unlike what's been going on in China for people who have a sense about that. But the war keeps coming back, and it comes back in two major ways in Vietnamese society right now. One amongst intellectuals who use the war as a way of critiquing the party. That the war was a good thing, but the way in which the party ran the war wasn't necessarily a good thing. And that was completely different than the kinds of propaganda that would have gone on during the war. So a whole series of films and novels that came out in Vietnam in the 1990s, again, saying that in a way the promises of the war were both independence and socialism, and that the socialist promise had gone unfulfilled. But more recently, it is the explosion of religion in Vietnam. You know, during the war itself, at least in northern Vietnam, the state downplayed religion, discouraged people from more traditional religious practices. Today, religion is all over the place. And you know, to give you a little bit of a sense of this, I first went to Vietnam in 1989. That was the first time really that Westerners could get back in after the war was done. And there's a huge French-built Catholic cathedral right in the center of Hanoi, beautiful cathedral. And I went to Mass one morning. I'm not Catholic, but I was curious, you know, who goes? And nobody essentially went. Older women, maybe a few older men, very, very sparse. I was in Hanoi in March. There are 10 masses every Saturday. They're full. I was at one of them. You can barely get in the door. And that's Catholicism. And it's only 10% of Vietnamese who are Catholic. Most Vietnamese are Buddhist. There's just a proliferation of Buddhist sites, Buddhist structures, Buddhist pilgrimage sites. And then lineage, family lineage, and sort of worshiping family lineage, which was always an important part of the Confucian tradition in Vietnam. This is all back as well. And the war intersects with it because with family altars. If you lived in the South after the war and you had a relative, maybe a son who had fought for the National Liberation Front, South Vietnam, maybe even North Vietnam, a distant relative, you couldn't honor the relative who had fought from the South. The South was the defeated force. You had to, in a sense, pretend that that child hadn't been there. In the last 10 years, people have felt comfortable again about displaying photographs of sons who were lost on the losing side, quote unquote. One can propitiate their graves, remember them. And so in these really profound everyday ways within families, there's been a huge transformation for people that's all about working out, very complicated memory politics from an earlier period.
Professor, in the South, are there still a lot of former South Vietnamese soldiers who are living in the country? Have they been so-called rehabilitated? Are they allowed full access to society in Vietnam?
Well, that's a really complicated question. I mean, a lot of higher-ranking South Vietnamese soldiers and government officials left Vietnam after 1975, some dramatically right as the war was coming to an end, but between 1975 and 1980, a big exodus of people. Many of them to the United States, but others to Australia, to France, to Canada. So there's a kind of global diaspora, really, of former South Vietnamese officials and generals who are living with their families other places. But not everybody could leave, and particularly people who were more ordinary soldiers. And when the war was first over, life was very difficult for them. There were these re-education camps that the state organized that were not fun. I mean, the conditions were very, very difficult in those camps. The idea was that somehow you would send people to the camps and they would come back believers in communism. That didn't tend to be the case in general anyway. But the conditions and the length of time that people were kept was really horrific in many cases. Those camps are long closed, and people did begin to fold back into society. And the economic reforms have changed the playing field in many ways, because for the economy to work, people need money. And the largest source of investment in Vietnam, beyond states, is the overseas Vietnamese community. Billions and billions of dollars being sent back into Vietnam. And so those families now have a kind of standing and stature within the economy that they wouldn't have had in an earlier period of time. If they want their kids to go to college, if they want to be involved in government and politics, those avenues still tend to be closed to families. That history of people's involvement with the war does mark people in that kind of way. But the economy and the changes in the economy in some ways have leveled the playing field for people in the South in a way that, again, 10, 15 years ago would have been hard to see.
How would you describe Vietnam's current relationship with the U.S.? And I just want to preface that by saying I remember visiting just a couple of years ago in Saigon, the American War of Aggression Museum, and watching the propaganda films that were being played at the Cu Chi tunnels prior to being able to go out and tour those.
Well, the War Atrocities Museum is an interesting case. When I was, again, just back this spring in Vietnam, I was meeting with a friend of mine, a historian who's now the president of the university in Ho Chi Minh City, and also sits on the city council. And he was telling me that the city has decided that that War Remnants Museum no longer serves a useful purpose. I think this was the way he put it. That it isn't, he was very delicate about it, but it was partly not effective for tourists, he said. As if you've been there, you can get a sense about why that might be so. But also, more importantly, that it wasn't effective for Vietnamese school children, which is in fact the major audience for which it and the presidential palace are preserved. And yet he said, we don't know what ought to replace it. We don't exactly know right now what sort of stories we think might be most effective to tell about the war. But there was something in what he was saying that was about a relationship back to America. Because again, if you're in the museum, it's very striking what you see. I mean, you see Agent Orange, you see various massacres, you don't see much contextualized around it, but you see, again, what would be the most horrific incidents of American violence there. The Vietnamese-American relationship is relatively good, it seems to me. You know, where the Vietnamese get prickly is discussions of human rights. The Americans unfailingly, Hillary Clinton was there last summer, reminded the Vietnamese about our commitment to human rights, questioned their commitment, and the Prime Minister, you know, not unexpectedly got very, very prickly about that sort of thing. These are largely concerns about, ironically, religion. And given the fact that religion is flourishing in certain ways in Vietnam, there's something of a mismatch between those. But the concerns particularly tend to be about their Protestant evangelical groups in central Vietnam. These were the areas where the mountain peoples were during the war. They worked very closely with the CIA. It's an area that the regime still believes may not be fully loyal, and so those concerns are still there. the sort of, the Vietnamese are most concerned about China, and they've always been most concerned about China, and that relationship has ebbed and flowed over time. Right after the war was done, the Chinese invaded in 1970.